Okay, according to my information, the solar eclipse is beginning right now in the vicinity of Huntington, West Virginia. I have my little camera video set up on the front porch of our home on Garretts Creek near Wayne, West Virginia. And again, the details are it's a partial solar eclipse. It begins today, August 21st, 2017 at 1:06 p.m. and it reaches its peak at 2:33 p.m. A 92% magnitude, which should be pretty dark. It will continue until 3:56 p.m. So since I probably don't have enough batteries and it would be kind of boring to record the whole thing, I've decided to record 4 5-minute stretches per hour. So, you know, basically an hour, 1 hour out of 3, and I'll do it 5 minutes at a time. And then I just had the inspiration that, well, since not too many people are going to be watching this, and since it's going to be pretty boring because there's nothing going on out there, you know, maybe I'll run out there once in a while and wave at the camera, or I may not, or maybe the dog will run by or something. But basically all you're seeing is the sunlight and the shadows, and perhaps you'll hear some of the night sounds. But anyway, I got the inspiration that, well, I could read something, I could narrate something, or I could talk, and but then that inspiration only came 15 or 20 minutes ago, and I couldn't think what to do. Still, I thought it was a good idea, and what I've decided to do is read about a dozen pages, if I can get that done in 10 5-minute periods, or 12, maybe 12, of this book. It's The System of the World by Neal Stephenson. The System of the World, Volume 3 of the Baroque Cycle. Now, Volumes 1 and 2 were Quicksilver and The Confusion, and I read those a couple of years ago, and I had started this third volume and then got sidetracked. And then recently I read a short novel, and I thought, well, I should read another novel. And I remembered having started this one, so I started it again from scratch, and over the last month read through it and enjoyed it very much. Now, the setting of these novels is between the late 17th century and the early 18th century. And the characters in it include the fictional character Daniel Waterhouse, who's a member of the Royal Society, and in his youth shared a room with Isaac Newton, and later became acquainted with Leibniz and various personages in Germany that Leibniz was friends with. And also one of the heroes is a fictional character called Jack Shafto, who's kind of the king of the vagabonds, and he also became, in his adventures, tangled up with this Daniel Waterhouse and Isaac Newton and Leibniz. And then in this last cycle, it's all coming to a head, and Daniel Waterhouse and Isaac Newton and Leibniz are all in a room with Her Royal Highness Caroline, Princess of Wales, Electoral Princess of Hanover, etc., etc. Now, she has been kind of educated by Leibniz, and she and Daniel Waterhouse are sort of trying to mediate a dispute between Leibniz and Newton about who founded the calculus. Okay. And so they've discussed that a little bit, and then they are going to leave that aside and discuss philosophical differences between Newton and Leibniz and how that might affect the modern world. I'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, it's now 1:20 p.m. and we're coming on our second 5-minute recording since the beginning of the eclipse. Initially I was thinking I would do 3 per hour and then a one at the end, which would make 10 total, and then I decided to do 4 per hour, and that would get us close to the end, and we would just conclude with 12. If I'm calculating correctly, this is the second of 12 5-minute periods. And I am going to read a dozen pages or so from The System of the World by Neal Stephenson. And we are in a private visit between the fictional character Daniel Waterhouse and the historical characters Sir Isaac Newton, Baron von Leibniz, and Her Royal Highness Caroline, Princess of Wales, Electoral Princess of Hanover, etc., etc. Okay, and they've had a brief discussion or allusion to the dispute about the calculus, which you can read about online and how it was finally settled. You can look it up in Wikipedia or wherever. And in any case, this is Princess Caroline talking on page 673 of The System of the World. And she says, "Then let us wash our hands of the calculus dispute and move on to metaphysics and natural philosophy. For I have long suspected, and Dr. Waterhouse will support me on this, that the calculus dispute was really an epiphenomenon of a far more profound, interesting, and momentous debate. Baron von Leibniz has served my house well as court philosopher. Sir Isaac, I trust, is desirous of doing likewise." A little aside, the House of Hanover is about to begin ruling England in the person, I believe, of Princess Caroline's husband, who will be King George. And so just as Baron von Leibniz, the German, has served her house well, now Newton will have a similar opportunity. So I continue. "It is chief among my aspirations, Highness," Newton responded. This elicited a slight eye roll from Leibniz, who glanced towards Daniel for support, but Daniel affected not to notice and remained grave of aspect. "I wonder if any royal house in the history of this world has enjoyed the distinction of being served at the same time by 2 such eminent philosophers. It is a rare thing, and I mean to make the most of it." This is Princess Caroline speaking. "You are both Christians, believers in a living and active God. You will both hold that humans are made in God's image, possessing free will. In mathematics and natural philosophy, your interests run on very similar lines, and yet there is between you a schism as deep as that between Scylla and Charybdis, a fundamental divergence of views that make it impossible for you to collaborate with each other. Which were not such a bad thing, perhaps, if I were still Princess of Ansbach or some other tiny place, and you, sir, a librarian, and you, sir, a vicar. But I am Princess of Wales. The house you both now serve is a great one. Some would say second only to the House of Bourbon. If the philosophy of that house is confused, why, it shall have dreadful consequences, difficult to foretell. A year ago, I asked Dr. Waterhouse to journey hither from Boston that we might go to work healing this breach. That you, Sir Isaac, and you, Baron von Leibniz, are here together in this room now is all his doing, but he did it at my command. His part in the thing is now done, and he has my gratitude forever. Your part, gentlemen, begin now." "Highness," said Newton, "I am very grateful to you for having stated with such clarity the truth of my views on God, the human spirit, and free will. For Baron von Leibniz, I'm sorry to report, has disseminated the slander that I am some sort of atheist. While it is true that I reject the doctrine of the Trinity, please know that I do so only out of a belief that the Homoousian doctrine promulgated at the Council of Nicaea was an error, straying from what Christians had believed until then and ought to believe now. Any person who seeks slander need not look so far afield nor delve so deep, Leibniz exclaimed, rising to his feet so forcefully that he had to take half a step towards Newton to steady himself. I saved this man's life 3 days ago, and gossip has already reached my ears that I am guilty of assaulting him. These willful distortions, sir, do nothing to bring us nigher true philosophy. I'll be back in 10 minutes. It's now 1:36 p.m., 30 minutes after the eclipse began, and I am continuing with my reading of the system of the world. I cannot imagine any slander more base than that I am an atheist, returned Newton, responding to Leibniz. Because of his ribs, which were hurt a few days earlier when Leibniz had rescued him and Daniel Waterhouse from an explosion, but in the process broke Newton's ribs. Because of his ribs, it was much more difficult for him to rise from his chair, but now he got his walking stick under his folded hands as if he were about to give it a go. An atheist? No, never would I spread such a calumny, on my honor. But spreading doctrines that incline others towards atheistical views is another matter. Of that you are, I regret to say, culpable. That was Leibniz. Newton responds, "Can one believe the incoherence of the man?" Newton burst out, and regretted it, for it hurt him to speak so vehemently. As long as his ribs were complaining anyway, he rose to his feet, then continued the outburst in a voice distorted by pain. "I am not an atheist," he claims to admit. Then he turns around and accuses me of spreading atheism. It is typical of his slippery discourse, his slippery metaphysics. They were interrupted, but only for a moment, by a thud emanating from the floor between them. For Princess Caroline, disgruntled and bored, had used the palm of her hand to roll the globe up out of its cradle and over the rim of the felt-padded great circle that held it captive, and the globe tumbled to the rug between Newton and Leibniz. She put a foot up on it, a most undignified posture for a princess, and began to roll it back and forth idly as the argument went on. "I do not think it is the least bit slippery," said Leibniz. "You may be the most sincere Christian in the world, sir, but if you publish doctrines that are obscure, incoherent, contradictory, and impossible for readers to follow, why, they may go astray in their thinking and tend towards doctrines you would never espouse. This is how you make amends for a false accusation of atheism, by saying my life's work is incoherent and contradictory? Pray do not make any more such apologies, sir, or I shall have to make amends to you by challenging you to a duel." Princess Caroline gave the globe a hard shove, and it rolled for a few yards across the carpet and scored a goal, as it were, in a large fireplace that accounted for most of one wall of the room. I suspect that's an anachronism, don't you? Score a goal? Anyway, I digress. The hearth was slightly lower than the floor of the room, so the globe lodged there and came to a stop between two andirons. "That globe will never do for a modern monarch," she announced. When the Prince of Wales and I move to this house, it shall have to be replaced by a new one, with more of geography and fewer of monsters and mermaids. One that shall be ready to receive lines of longitude whensoever that Roger Comstock finds someone to award his prize to. That refers to a contest for someone to find a way of discovering longitude when out on a ship, or determining longitude. I continue. She rose, Princess Caroline rose now to her feet, and Newton and Leibniz, finally remembering their manners, turned to track her as she walked towards the fireplace. First, though, she wrenched a burning taper from the chair-side candelabrum. And I will continue this in 10 minutes. It is now 1:52 p.m. and I continue with the system of the world, the conversation between Leibniz and Newton and Princess Carolyn. Princess Carolyn wrenched a burning taper from the chairside candelabrum and says, "As a rule, I am averse to burning things found in libraries, but this must be reckoned no loss at all compared to the damage that the two of you are inflicting on philosophy by your bickering." She bent her knees and executed a graceful descent until she was sitting on the floor beside the hearth, skirts arranged around her. "I see things sometimes in dreams or in daydreams. Some of them I quite fancy, for they seem to carry meaning. Those I remember and think back on. There's one such vision that has stuck in my head quite as melodies often do, and I can't seem to get rid of it. I shall try to do justice to it thusly." And she reached out with the candle and let its flame lave the underside of the globe. The globe was of wood and too heavy to catch fire rapidly, but paper gores printed with images of continents had been pasted over it. The paper caught fire and a ragged flame began to spread, consuming the cartographer's work and leaving behind it a blackened and featureless sphere. "Sophie kept trying to tell me before she died," Sophie, this was her mother-in-law, I believe. "Sophie kept trying to tell me before she died that a new system of the world was being made. Oh, it is not a terrible novel thing to say, I know, and Sophie knew that the third volume of your Principia Mathematica bears that name, Sir Isaac. Since she died, I have become quite convinced that she was correct, and moreover that the system is to be born not at Versailles, but here," and I think they're in England, as they speak in London, "but here, and that this shall be its prime meridian, and all else shall be reckoned and ruled from here. It is a pleasing notion that there is to be such a system, and that I might play some small part in being its midwife. I think of the globe with its neat parallels and meridians as the emblem of this system, what the cross is to Christianity. But I am troubled by the vision of such a globe in flames. What you are looking at here is a poor rendition of it. In my nightmares it is ever so much more lovely and dreadful." "What do you suppose that vision signifies, Highness?" asked Daniel Waterhouse. She replies, "That this system, if it is set up wrong, might be..." Okay, it's 2:07 p.m., approximately an hour after the beginning of the eclipse, and it's getting noticeably darker now. I had a little misgobble because my memory card filled up and I had to go delete some stuff off of it so I could begin again. But I am back, and if I can find where I left off, I will begin again. I'm at the bottom of page 675. Princess Carolyn, has had the vision of the burning globe due to an intrinsic contradiction in the system of the world. And she thinks if Isaac Newton and Baron von Leibniz, Sir Isaac Newton and Baron von Leibniz could resolve their philosophical disputes, then perhaps we could found this new system of the world on a surer foundation. "What do you suppose that vision signifies, Highness?" asked Daniel Waterhouse. "That this system, if it is set up wrong, might be doomed from the start," said Carolyn. "Oh, it shall be a wonder to behold at first, and all shall marvel at its regularity, its economy, and the ingenuity of them that framed it. Perhaps it shall work as planned for a decade or a century or more, and yet if it has been made wrong at the beginning, it shall burn in the end, and my vision shall be realized in a manner infinitely more destructive than this." She gave the smoking globe a nudge. It had been wholly scoured by the flames and become a trackless black orb. Daniel now stepped over and gave her a hand up from the hearth where she had been sitting. "I do not concern myself so much," said Carolyn, turning towards Leibniz and Newton, "with bankers, merchants, clockmakers, or longitude finders, and their roles in the creation of this system, or even with astronomers and alchemists. But I'm terribly concerned with my philosophers, for if they get it wrong, then the system is flawed and shall burn in the end. Stop your bickering and get to work. As it pleases your Highness, said Sir Isaac. What would you have us work on? Baron von Leibniz may be on to something, said Caroline, which is that though you and most other fellows of the Royal Society are true Christians and believers in free will, the very doctrines and methods that the Royal Society has promulgated have caused many to question the existence of God, the divinity of Christ, the authority of the Church, the premise that we have souls endowed with free will. Why, Dr. Waterhouse himself has lately given me the lamentable news that he has quite abandoned all such doctrines. This earned Daniel perturbed and puzzled looks from Newton and Leibniz. All he could do in the face of such disapproval from such minds was to make a frail smile and shrug. Caroline continued, as so much of civilization is rooted in those beliefs, this strikes me as one way in which our system of the world might be set up wrong and thus self-doomed. Neither you, Sir Isaac, nor you, Baron von Leibniz, sees the slightest contradiction between your faith and the true and fearless pursuit of natural philosophy. But you differ radically in how you reconcile the one with the other. If you two cannot manage it, no one can, and so I would like for you to work on that, if you please. Your Royal Highness's discourse concerning the system of the world and the threat of its running awry at some future time puts me in mind of a thing I do not understand in the philosophy of Sir Isaac Newton, Leibniz began. Sir Isaac describes that system by which the heavenly bodies are kept in their gyres and made to orbit round and round forever. Fine, but he seems to say that God, who created this system and set it in motion, must from time to time reach in and tinker with it, as an hourologist adjusts the working of his clock. As if God lacked the foresight or the power to make it a perpetual motion. You are overreacting to a passage from my optics that is really not all that important, Isaac began. On the contrary, sir, it is very important indeed, if it is wrong and puts wrong ideas in people's heads. Then, as you are at such pains to correct my errors, Herr Leibniz, let me return to the favor in kind. This similitude, likening the universe to a clock and God to an hourologist, is faulty. An hourologist is presented with certain laws or facts of natures, namely that weights descend towards the center of the earth and springs push back when deflected. Taking these as givens, he hacks away at his bench to produce some mechanism that exploits these properties in a more or less ingenious way. Ones who are more ingenious make clocks that require adjustments less often, and one who was perfect would, I suppose, make one that would never need it at all. But God does not merely compose the objects and forces that were given to him. He does not merely compose the objects and forces that were given to him, but is himself the author of those objects and forces, author and preserver. Nothing happens in this world without his government and his inspection. Think of him not as a watchmaker, but as a king. Suppose there were a kingdom where all things ran forever in an orderly and regular way without the king ever having to attend, make judgments, or exercise his powers. If it were in sum so ordered that the king could be removed from it without any diminution, then he would be a king only in name, and not deserving of the respect and loyalty of his subjects. Like the God of Spinoza, said Caroline, if I'm following your similitude correctly. Indeed, Your Highness, Newton says. Okay, it's 2:14, and I will be back in 10 minutes or so. Okay, it's 2:24. The twilight is upon us, and I continue with the dialogue between Leibniz and Newton in the system of the world towards the middle of 677. Indeed, Highness, Newton said, and so if Baron von Leibniz is of the view that the world can go on forever, without the continual inspection and governance of God, why then I say that it is his philosophy that shall incline men towards atheism. That is not my view, as I think you know, said Leibniz equably. I believe that God takes part in the world's workings at every moment, but not in the sense of mending it when it has gone awry. To say otherwise is to say God makes mistakes and changes his mind, instead of which I believe in a pre-established harmony reflecting that God has foreseen all and provided for it. To which Sir Isaac was about to make some rejoinder when he was interrupted by Daniel. This, I believe, is the least interesting topic that the two of you could debate. It is really an argument about the signification of certain words and the applicability of certain metaphors, the clockmaker, the king, etc. Both Leibniz and Newton were pressing their lips together to keep all their objections and rejoinders from bursting forth in a Pandoran onslaught. Rather than see the rest of the day devoted to the aftermath, Daniel turned to Princess Carolyn and continued, without let-up. Or, to put it another way, Your Royal Highness, are you willing to stipulate that Sir Isaac and Baron von Leibniz both believe in a God who is aware of and active in the universe, and that this God, in framing the universe, was not chargeable of any errors? Indeed, Dr. Waterhouse, it is plain to see that both of them believe as much, though I wish you would believe it too. I am not really a participant, Highness, so let us leave my views out of the reckoning. On the contrary, Dr. Waterhouse, said the Princess, every philosophical dialogue I've ever read requires one interlocutor who is of a skeptical habit of mind, or of a stupid, Daniel put in. Be he skeptical, stupid, or both, the others try to win him over to their view of things. Carolyn had suddenly gone all flushed and girlish and looked to Newton and Leibniz for their support in the venture. Fantasizing she saw what she wanted, she turned back to the bemused Daniel, who was saying, am I to understand that the purpose of the discussion is now to subject me to a religious conversion? You are the one who complained a moment ago of feeling stupid, said Carolyn, a bit miffed. So listen and be enlightened. I am yours to command, Highness, and ready for enlightenment. But I have you to know that my stupidity and my skepticism are two sides of the same coin, and are of a very particular kind, which is carefully thought out. John Locke was of the same mind, and set it down in words better than I ever could. To go into it here would be a half an hour's digression. Suffice it to say that as a result of being near men like Newton and Leibniz, men like Locke and I are all too keenly aware of the limits of our own intellects and the dullness of our own senses, and not only of ours, but of most other people's too. And as a result of studying natural philosophy, we have got glimmerings of the immensity and complexity of the universe that were not available to anyone until of late, and are known only to a few now. The imbalance between the grand mysteries of the universe, as opposed to our own feeble faculties, leads us to set very modest expectations as to what we shall and shan't be able to understand, and makes us passing suspicious of anyone who propounds dogma or seems to fantasy he has got it all figured out. Having said which, I must concede that if anyone can figure it all out, it would be these two, and so I'll listen, provided they confine their discussion to topics that are interesting. And what would you denominate interesting, Dr. Waterhouse? Asked the Princess. The two labyrinths. Carolyn and Leibniz both smiled. Newton looked stormy. I do not know what this is meant to signify. Dr. Leibniz mentioned to me long ago that there are two sorts of intellectual labyrinths into which all thinking people are sooner or later drawn, said Carolyn. One is the composition of the continuum, which is to say, what is matter made of, what's the nature of space, etc. The other is the problem of free will. Do we have a choice in what we do? Which is like saying, do we have souls? I'll agree with Baron von Leibniz, at least to this point. These are interesting questions, and so many spend so much time thinking on them that the similitude of a labyrinth is well taken. Daniel reminded them, the Princess has requested that the discussion be productive of a better system of the world. I put it to you that the latter question, free will and the spirit, is, as far as that goes, more important. Myself, I'm comfortable with the notion that we are machines made of meat, that there is no more free will in us than there is in a cuckoo clock, and that the spirit, soul, of whatever you want to call it, is a fairy tale. Many who study natural philosophy will arrive at the same conclusion unless the two of you find a way of convincing them otherwise. Her Royal Highness seems to be of the view that such beliefs, if they should be imbued into the new system that her house is erecting, shall lead to the realization of her nightmare. So if I'm to be simplicio in this dialogue, pray explain how it is that there may be such a thing as free will and spirit that may do as it pleases, unbounded by the mathematic laws of our mechanical philosophy. And I will now take a break for approximately 10 minutes. It's 2:30 p.m. Perhaps I will come back at 2:33 and get a shot of that. Okay, it's now 2:33. Supposedly this is the maximum. As you can see, there's still sunlight and shadow, but it is very dark sunlight, if you will. It's kind of like evening twilight, and I don't hear any night birds or night bugs or night sounds, but it's interesting. And it's kind of cooled off a little bit. It's noticeably cooler out here. Maybe I'll give you a brief view of me walking out here in it. I forgot and looked at the sun. I hope it was not for long enough to hurt anything. It was for a brief second, but it was very bright. It's not anywhere near to total eclipse to look at it. Very well, it's now 2:35. I'll be back in about 10 minutes. Okay, I'm back a little early. It's now 2:43. I'm also in the middle of fixing lunch, and so I need to coordinate that project with this project that I'll read a little bit more. So, Daniel Waterhouse has just said, so if I am to be simplicio in this dialogue, pray explain how it is that there may be such a thing as free will, and a spirit that may do as it pleases, unbounded by the mathematic laws of our mechanical philosophy. Well, if you put it that way, it's an old problem, said Leibniz. Descartes saw straight away that mechanical philosophy might spell trouble for free will, in that it led to a new sort of predestinationism, not rooted in theology like that of the Calvinists, but rather growing out of the simple fact that matter obeys predictable laws. Yes, said Daniel, and then he got it all wrong by putting the soul in the pineal gland. I'd rather say he got it wrong before then by dividing the universe into matter and cogitation, Leibniz said. And I'd say he got it wrong even before then by supposing that there was a problem, said Newton. There's nothing wrong in recognizing that part of the universe is a passive mechanism and part of it is active and thinking. But Monsieur Descartes, seeing what was done to Galileo by the papists, was in such a terror of the Inquisition that his resolve failed. Very well, in any case, we agree that Descartes perceived a problem and came up with a wrong answer, said Daniel. Does either of you have a better one to offer? Sir Isaac, it sounds as if you deny the very existence of any such problem. You may read Principia Mathematica without finding discourse of souls, spirits, cogitation, or what have you, said Isaac. It's about planets, forces, gravity, and geometry. I do not address, and certainly do not pretend to solve, the riddles that so confounded Monsieur Descartes. Why should we attempt to frame hypotheses about such matters? Because if you do not, Sir Isaac, others of less brilliance will, and they will frame the wrong ones, Carolyn said. Newton bristled. My work on gravity and optics has brought me a kind of fame which is a thing I never sought nor wanted. It has done me nothing good and much bad, as now when I'm expected to utter profundities on topics far afield from what I've chosen to study. So says the public Sir Isaac Newton, said Daniel, author of Principia Mathematica and master of the Mint. But this is a private gathering which might benefit from the participation of the private Sir Isaac, the author of the Praxis. Praxis has not been published, Isaac pointed out, and not because I have deemed it somehow private, but because 'tis yet unfinished, and so not fit to talk of. What is Praxis? Carolyn inquired. What Principia Mathematica was to mechanical philosophy, Praxis would be to alchemy, said Isaac. Back in 10 minutes. Okay, it's now 2:58, and the temperature has dropped from about 87 to 79, as best as I can calculate, though I think it's beginning to probably warm up again now. It's certainly getting lighter again, and I will continue reading from the System of the World. So Isaac Newton has said, whereas Principia Mathematica was a finished and published work, his work on alchemy called Praxis is yet unfinished. And Princess Carolyn asked, what is Praxis? And Isaac says, what Principia Mathematica was to mechanical philosophy, Praxis would be to alchemy, said Isaac. A laconic answer. May we hear more? If I may say so, Highness, said Daniel. Sir Isaac learned early that anything he openly professed was liable to come under attack to his great aggravation and embarrassment, and so became chary of professing anything until he had got it perfect and made it impervious. Praxis is not ready yet. Then it seems I shall not have any satisfaction whatsoever, said Carolyn, a bit poutingly, which is entirely my fault for having mentioned Praxis, Daniel hastened to say. But I had a reason for doing it, which was to say that though the public Sir Isaac might profess not to see the problems that so captured the attention of Descartes, I believe that the private Sir Isaac has been working on just that problem. As I state quite plainly in Principia Mathematica, said Isaac, in a bit of high clarion self-righteous tone, it is not my intention in that work to consider the causes and seats of force. That gravity exists and acts at a distance is taken as a given. Why and how it does are not considered. I would not be human if I did not have some curiosity as to what gravity was and how it works, and even if it were otherwise, Baron von Leibniz and his continental supporters would never allow me a moment's peace on the matter. So yes, I would understand force. I have toiled at it. The ignorant have styled my toils alchemy. At this, Daniel threw him an irritated look, which Isaac, to his credit, did not fail to notice. Sayus, Isaac said, it's not wrong to call this work alchemy, but that word, so laden with the baggage of centuries, doesn't do it justice. May I ask a question about your research in this area, however you choose to denote it? Leibniz asked. Provided it contains no hidden barbs or springs, Isaac allowed. Leibniz now achieved the difficult feat of rolling his eyes, heaving a great sigh of exasperation, and voicing his question all at the same time. If I understand what force means in your metaphysics, which is the only coherent definition of force that I know of, Newton slipped in, glancing at the princess. Leibniz, with some visible straining, and affected a saintly mien during this. It appeared to mean some invisible influence acting across what you think of as the vacuum of space at infinite speed, which causes objects to accelerate, even though nothing seems to be touching them. Setting aside your strangely hedged and qualified way of talking about vacuum and space, that is a reasonable description of gravitational force, Newton allowed. Now in your metaphysics, which I concede happens to be that used by just about everyone, there is this thing called space, which is mostly empty but has lumpy bits here and there called bodies, some being heavy spherical ones, which we call planets, but also any amount of clutter, such as this poker, yonder candelabrum, the rug, and these bipedal animated bodies answering to the names Daniel Waterhouse, Princess Wilhelmina Caroline of Brandenburg-Ansbach, etc. That much is so obvious that some of us are amazed to hear a learned man waste breath pointing it out, said Newton. Some of those bodies answer only to the deterministic laws of mechanical philosophy, said Leibniz, such as the globe, which rolled into the fireplace because Her Royal Highness gave it a shove. But the bodies denominated Daniel Waterhouse, etc., are somehow different. True, they are subject to the same forces as the globe. Our friend Daniel plainly feels gravity's pull, or else he would float away. But such bodies act in complicated ways not explainable by the laws set forth in your Principia Mathematica. When Dr. Waterhouse sits down to write an essay, let us say about the latitudinarian philosophy espoused by him and the late Mr. Locke, we may observe his quill maneuvering all over the page in the most complicated paths imaginable. Here are none of the conic sections of the Principia. No equation can predict the trajectory of Daniel's nib over the page, for it results from innumerable and unfathomable minute contractions of the small muscles of his fingers and hands. If we dissect a man's hands, we find that these muscles are governed by nerves, which may be easily enough traced back to the brain as rivers come from springs in the mountains. Remove the brain or sever its connection to the hand, and lo, the limb becomes as simple as yonder globe. That is, we may predict its future movements from Principia and plot them in conics. And so it is evident that to the force of gravity, which acts on everything, are superadded other forces observable only in animals and productive of infinitely more complicated and interesting arguments. Footnote: as everyone in the room knew, Leibniz was using the word animal in an ancient and somewhat technical sense of something animated, that is, possessing or possessed by an anima or spirit. It's 3:04 p.m. and I'm going to go back in and attend to the conclusion of our lunch, and I'll be back in 10 minutes or so. Okay, it's 3:18. The mail just stopped at the mailbox and some other traffic going up the road. As you should see, it's getting brighter out and warmer out. I didn't check the temperature this time, but I will check it next time and let you know. In the meantime, I'm going to continue reading from the System of the World. Leibniz has just been talking about how the movement of Daniel Waterhouse's pen on paper to write down various things involved some spiritual impulse that seems to transcend the mechanical laws described by Newton in Principia Mathematica. And Newton says, "I am with you so far," said Newton, "if all you are saying is that forces other than gravity act on Dr. Waterhouse's pen when he is writing something, and that such forces do not appear to motivate rocks or comets." Hooke was fascinated by mussels, Daniel put in, and looked at them under his microscope and labored at making artificial ones so that he could fly. Those, I predict, could have been described by mechanical philosophy. After all, they were not more than practical applications of the rarefying engine, and such subject to Boyle's law. With more time and better microscopes, Hooke might have found within mussels tiny mechanisms likewise describable by mathematical laws, and thereby put to rest any supposed mysteries. But he stopped as both Newton and Leibniz were making the same sort of hand-waving gestures employed to bat away farts. "You miss the point," said Leibniz. "I have no interest in the physics of mussels. Think, sir, if Hooke had made his flying machine driven in a deterministic fashion by rarefying engines, what more then would he have had to add to this device to make it flutter to a safe perch atop the cupola of Bedlam, and balance there as 'twas buffeted by divers wind gusts, and take flight again without oar setting, and tumbling to the ground like a shot squab? I'm trying to draw our attention to what it is that comes down those nerves from the brain, the decisions, or rather the physical manifestation thereof, the characters, as it were, in which they are writ and transmitted to the muscles, that they may inform what would otherwise be without form and void. I understand that, said Daniel, and I say it is all pistons and cylinders, weights and springs to the very top. And that's all I need to explain how I inform ink on a page and how the bird informs the air with its wings. And I agree with you, said Leibniz. This produced a dumbfounded pause. Have I converted you to the doctrine of materialism so easily? Daniel inquired. By no means, said Leibniz. I say only that though the machine of the body obeys deterministic laws, it does so in accordance with the desires and dictates of the soul because of the pre-established harmony. Of that we must needs hear more, for it is very difficult to understand, said the princess. Chiefly because it is wrong, said Sir Isaac. 3:22 p.m., taking a break. I'll let you see this pickup truck go down the road. It's 3:32 p.m. The eclipse will be over in about 25 minutes. As you can see, it's very bright again. Temperature is rising. It had gotten down to about 79. It's now about 82, possibly a little higher by now. And I continue reading The System of the World. Top of page 683. Leibniz mentions pre-established harmony that coordinates deterministic laws with the desires and dictates of the soul. And Princess Carolyn says it's difficult to understand, and Sir Isaac Newton says that's chiefly because it's wrong. Carolyn now had to literally step between the two philosophers. Then we are all in agreement that further discourse concerning the pre-established harmony is wanted from Baron von Leibniz, she said. But first I would fain hear Sir Isaac address the phenomena of which Dr. Waterhouse and Leibniz have just been discoursing. Sir Isaac, we have heard from both these gentlemen that they are wholly satisfied it is all mechanism to the very top. What of you? Do you require something more? Newton said, if we allow not only the muscles, but the nerves and even the brain itself to be pistons and cylinders and weights and springs, as you put it, whose machinations might be observed and described by some future hook, then we must still explain how those mechanisms are informed by the soul, spirit, or whatever we are going to call it, the thing that has free will, that is not subject to deterministic laws, and that accounts for our being human, as opposed to just machines. This is ultimately the same problem as we discoursed of earlier, the problem you find boring, Daniel, of God's relationship to the universe. For the relationship that our souls bear to our bodies is akin to the relationship that God bears to the entire universe. If God is to be something more than an absentee landlord, something more than the perfect watchmaker who sets his clock a-run and walks away from it, then we must account for how he influences the movements of things in the world. This gets us around to that mysterious phenomenon called force. And when we discourse of animal motion, we must in the end address a like problem, namely of how the soul that inhabits a body may influence the operation of what is in the end just a big soggy clock. I could not disagree more, by the way, said Leibniz. The soul and body influence each other not at all. Then how does my soul know that yonder candle is flickering? Asked Princess Carolyn, for I can only know such a thing through my eyes, which are parts of my body. Because God has put into your soul a principle representative of the candle flame and everything else in the universe, said Leibniz. But that is most certainly not how God perceives things. He perceives all things because he continually produces them. And so I reject any such analogies likening God's relationship to the universe and ours to our bodies. I do not understand Baron von Leibniz's hypothesis at all, Isaac confessed. What is your hypothesis, Sir Isaac? It's 3:37. I'll be back in 10 minutes. (3:42 p.m.), temperature 83. What is your hypothesis, Sir Isaac? That most of the animal body is a determined machine, I'll grant. That it is controlled from the brain has been proved by Willis and others. It follows simply that by laws of God's choosing, the soul has the power to operate upon the brain and thereby to influence animal movements. This is just Descartes and the pineal gland all over again, Leibniz scoffed. He was wrong about the pineal gland, Newton said, but I'll grant a certain formal resemblance between his way of thinking about it and mine. In each case, Daniel translated, there is some sense in which a free, non-corporal, non-mechanical spirits can effect physical changes in the workings of the machinery of the brain. I think that much is obvious, as is the fact that God, who is likewise a non-corporal spirit, has power to effect physical changes, that is, to exert force upon anything whatsoever in this universe. And is it the case that when you study the causes and seats of force in your praxis work, you seek to understand forces of that type as well? I do not think that any account of force that has failed to address this topic could be deemed complete. When Sir Isaac was working on the Principia, said Daniel, I paid him a visit up at Trinity. He had requested what seemed to me to be an odd lot of information, tables of the tides, data on certain comet, astronomical observations of Jupiter and Saturn. Well, it was a long ride, and by the time I had reached Cambridge, I had managed to work out that there was a common thread running through all these: gravity. Gravity causes the tides and determines the orbits of the comets and planets alike. To us it is obvious now, but back then it was by no means agreed that a comet, let us say, might be bound by the same force that kept the Earth in its gyre. Isaac's triumph was to perceive that all these phenomena were attributable to the same cause, working everywhere in the same way. Now, I have long been nonplussed by Isaac's alchemical research, but as the years have gone by, I have perceived that he would achieve a similar triumph by finding a single common underlying explanation for the phenomena that we think of as diverse and unrelated as free will, God's presence in the universe, miracles, and the transmutation of chemical elements. Couched in the willfully obscure jargon of the alchemists, this cause or principle, or whatever one wants to call it, is known as the philosopher's stone, or some other term, such as the philosophic mercury, the vital agent, the latent or subtle spirit, the secret fire, the material soul of matter, the invisible inhabitant, the body of light, the seed, the seminal virtue. You are confusing a number of different ideas, said Isaac, but this does at least prove that you perused my notes before burning them. At this, Carolyn was taken aback for a moment, then curiosity got the better of her. What is this agent or spirit? Have you seen it, Sir Isaac? I see it now, in the emotions and thoughts flickering across your face, Highness. I see its effect everywhere, was the somewhat evasive response of Newton. In nature, I perceive two categories of actions, mechanical and vegetable. By mechanical, I mean, of course, just the sort of thing that Dr. Waterhouse and Leibniz discoursed of earlier, in a word, clockwork. By vegetable, I do not mean turnips. This is a new and vulgar meaning of the word. I use it in its ancient sense of something animate, living, and growing. It describes generative and creative processes. Clocks, even good ones, run down and wear out. The mechanical world decays. Counterpoised against this tendency to decline must be some creative principle, the active seed, the subtle spirit. An unimaginably tiny quantity of this, acting upon a vastly larger bulk of insipid, dead, inactive matter, wreaks immense, even miraculous transformations, to which I give the general name vegetation. Just as the generative principle of gravity manifests itself in diverse ways, such as tides, the orbits of comets, and the trajectory of bullets, so the vegetative principle may be perceived by those who know how to look for it in diverse places. Just to mention one example which we discoursed of earlier, a flying machine constructed of artificial muscles would be a mechanical device whose fate, I believe, would be to crash to the ground like a corpse of a bird that has died on the wing. If the machine were to take flight, which would mean sensing every function of the air and responding in the correct way, I should ascribe that ultimately to the workings of some sort of vegetative principle. But Daniel is correct in thinking that it is also related to such matters as souls, miracles, and certain of the more profound and astonishing chemical transformations. 3:47 p.m. Back in 10 minutes, give or take a little bit. Okay, it's 3:54 p.m. The eclipse will be officially over here in about 2 minutes, and I will finish up with this excerpt from The System of the World. Someone asked Newton here, but do you think that there is ultimately some physical substance at work, something you could touch and observe? Yes, I do, he says, and have been searching for it. And I think I know where to find some, Isaac said, and turned to glower at Daniel. This is in reference to some special so-called Solomonic gold that Daniel has in his possession that is heavier than normal gold and supposedly has this sort of quintessential element in the interstices of the molecules or something. So Isaac is glowering at Daniel, but the princess missed this as she was turning to Leibniz. Baron von Leibniz, she said, can your view be reconciled with Sir Isaac's? Leibniz sighed. It is awkward, he said. To my ears, all of this sounds like a rearguard action fought by a good Christian retreating before the onslaught of mechanical philosophy. That could not be more wrong, snapped Newton. There is mechanical and there is vegetable. I study both. But you've already ceded half the battle to mechanical. There is no ceding, sir. Have you not read my Principia? The mechanical world exists. The mechanical philosophy describes it. Dr. Waterhouse would say that mechanism describes not just half, but all of it, Leibniz said. I take the opposite view, which is that vegetable is all, and what we think of as mechanical is only the superficies of underlying processes that are not mechanical at all. We await a coherent explanation, said Isaac. Philosophers of a mechanic frame of mind break all things down into atoms, to which they ascribe properties that to them seem reasonable, which means mechanical properties, mass, extension, and the ability to collide and stick to one another. Then from this they try to explain gravity and souls and miracles. It leads them to difficulties. Instead, I break all things down into monads, to which I ascribe what some would call soul-like properties. They can perceive, think about their perceptions, decide, and act. And from this it is no great difficulty to explain that things are so troublesome in a mechanical-minded atomic philosophy, everything that you put under the rubric of vegetation, including our own ability to think, decide, and act. However, it is difficult to explain the things that are, in an atomic philosophy, idiotically simple and obvious, such as space and time. Space and time, two minor omissions that no one is likely to notice, grumbled Newton. If I may say so, your own conception of space is by no means as straightforward as it seems at first, Leibniz said, very much in the style of one who was firing the opening salvo of another long argument. But before this could get going, the door of the room opened, and Johann von Heckelbar could be seen standing there, holding, in a very significant way, a letter. Behind him, Eliza was pacing back and forth with a fist balled up in front of her lips. Princess Caroline stared into Johann's eyes and cocked her head. She did not say aloud, I told you not to bother me, but it came through so distinctly that all heads turned back towards Johann, expecting from him an immediate apology. Instead, he raised his eyebrows and stood his ground. Caroline closed her eyes and sighed. Newton, Leibniz, and Waterhouse stepped back to clear her path out of the room, for they had all understood at the same moment that there was only one person who had this authority, Caroline's father-in-law, the as yet uncrowned King of England. And that ends this excerpt from System of the World. This Van Heckelbach is Princess Caroline's lover in this fictional account. And her husband, I guess, is going to be the Prince of Wales, and it's her father-in-law that's about to be crowned king. King George, as I said earlier. With that, I'll close this off. The eclipse is over, and it's 3:59 p.m. I'm going to walk down and get the mail, and then try to piece all these short videos together into something that will be possibly edifying to watch. We'll see. And that ends this video on the day of the partial eclipse. I think that it didn't really look like a 92% eclipse to me, but it was fun, and see you back here in 2024 or whenever. Bye-bye.